Now we are moving on to the second to last topic, which is an analysis of what is being achieved in Glasgow by Mitchell Beer. Now, Mitchell is publisher of Energy Mix, free and widely subscribed e-digest on climate change, energy, and the shift away from fossil fuels. Mitchell has a background in renewable energy stretching back to 1977. So that's all I'll say now. But let me remind you before I turn over to Mitchell that if you have any questions, please pose them via chat. Mitchell, over to you.
Thanks very much, Richard. And first of all, tomorrow, best of luck on the second week of the COP. And thanks to the organizers for the invitation to be here, to everybody for taking time out of your Sunday to attend. One thing that I take away from what we've just heard is tomorrow's essential point about military emissions falling outside the Paris Agreement. I would say that if there's one to-do item that you haven't heard yet, probably, to take away from this session, that's the one that I've heard so far. And also just the basic democratic access to the COP has been so severely limited out to it, including the vaccine apartheid that has prevented so many people from the less vaccinated countries that are also the most vulnerable in the climate emergency from even being represented. Something like 1/3 of small island states have not had their regular negotiators on site, I've been told. I'm coming in from unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory, also known as Ottawa. We've been following the news at a distance and publishing 5 editions of our e-digest each week rather than 3. So we have the irony here. This is COP bizarreness, folks. You're getting what sounded like a wonderful outsider's view of what's going on from somebody who made the trip from Glasgow, and probably for better and for worse, a more insider view from somebody who's 5 time zones away. I really hope those two sides of the story will fit together, will knit together and intersect, because I think both parts are absolutely essential to what we need to get done. Today was supposed to be a day off at the COP, but the big breaking news this morning was that a bullet point outline of the eventual COP cover decision, which is the official statement of what 195 countries have agreed at Glasgow, that draft outline was published this morning. And what was striking about it was that they did manage to use the word emissions twice, but they did not once use the words energy, fossil fuels, or renewables. All of us on the panel and in the audience could spend 3 hours dissecting that, but there's a little bit of ground that I'd like to cover before coming back to it. And that begins with the flurry of side announcements that you heard about from Gail. India promised a net zero target of by 2070 and a 50% renewables target for 2030, which the analysis said put them on track for a 1.5 degree future. And I don't think anybody saw that coming pre-COP. The methane promise was 30% by 2030. The science says that it should be 45 or 50. The deforestation pledge for 2030 is underfunded by a factor of about 4. Indonesia backed out of it within a couple of days, saying we didn't agree to stop deforestation by 2030. And meanwhile, it allows the loggers 9 years to keep going. And if anybody would like to pass a side bet on whether Jair Bolsonaro can log the rest of the Amazon in 9 years, you know he will try, because this deal allows him to. A really interesting piece was this 2022 phase out of international public financing for oil, gas, and coal, and shifting that money, about $18 billion a year, to renewables. This was the first time that any talk of international public financing included oil and gas. And to many people's surprise, the last minute decision, and it was last minute, was that Canada would sign on. It's been pointed out that this is international, not domestic. It is new investment, not existing. So those are the holes in it. And they've still freed up $18 billion a year that can go from the wrong kind of investment to the right. So in this red alert emergency, right, we're in the COP. So we have these good news, bad news kind of decisions, when what we need is unequivocal decisions. This week, we have the announcement of the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance coming up, led by Denmark and Costa Rica. Quebec has announced that they're joining. The last word that Canada might not, I'm going to guess. Watch this space, but I haven't heard that from anybody in Glasgow. And then finally, this announcement of $130 trillion, and I would do my Dr. Evil imitation, but my family tells me I never get it right, of Mark Carney's Glasgow Financing Alliance for Net Zero. The caveat on it is that and we checked with chief finance people about this to get the story. In order to get bankers to sign on, they had to give them enough flexibility to find their own path to net zero, which can include continuing fossil fuel investment. And if that had not been allowed, what the spokesperson told us was many of those institutions would not have signed up. So when you've been hearing, now we've heard in the opening video and through the session that we're still on track for 2.7 degrees Celsius. There was a moment in the course of the week when the head of the International Energy Agency, Fatih Birol, stood up at a session and said, we'll see what happens for the next 9 days, but meanwhile, let's celebrate because all of these promises bring us to 1.8 degrees Celsius. And there was massive pushback on that because the assumptions behind it are, first of all, that everybody who made those promises meant what they said. So Indonesia wouldn't back down on deforestation, that Poland wouldn't pull out of the coal agreement and so forth. And secondly, that even if they meant it, that they would deliver on their promises. So we have all of this activity. We have, on the other hand, 100,000 people out in the rain in Glasgow and 1 million people around the world shouting back, blah, blah, blah. And there's potential, I think, that both of those storylines, both of those narratives are right. And which one predominates over the next week and beyond will depend on three things. First of all, how the negotiations go while we're still at the COP, the crucial details of the way those pledges are implemented. And those details will come out over the next weeks and months. And it's going to be on all of us to organize and mobilize and push like hell wherever we are to get the best possible outcomes on those decisions. And then thirdly, how everybody shows up and does their part afterwards. Something that's really fallen out at me over the last week is that it's right, but it's only part of the story to say, you know, what's Justin Trudeau doing? What's Stephen Guilbeault doing now that he's the minister? And so yes, of course, and it's about every industry, every sector, every community, and about the protections and the just transition for the most vulnerable among those communities. So it needs to be right across the society. And of course, there needs to be leadership from government, but we are uniquely positioned to do as civil society is push out those other aspects that are absolutely essential. This week and next, I've been doing a daily video spot with the Utility Collaborative in the United States. And I don't have time to explain to you the intricacies of why and how, but I'm really glad to be doing that. And it's really interesting to see these issues and to try to respond to these issues through the lens of the utility community. So getting outside our regular bubble and thinking through and learning from other sectors and communities how these issues land with them, how they play for them, and how we get progress in those settings, I think is a really important part of the picture. How Canada is showing up so far, what we are hearing is, first of all, that once again, Canada signing on to the International Public Finance Agreement, it was a last-minute decision. It was not expected. It's really good news. As far as it goes, again, with the typical COP caveat, and in general, what one of the civil society negotiators was telling me earlier today is that Canada has a reputation for being constructive in COP speak in the negotiations, in the negotiating rooms, and that's happening again this year. So the general sense is within the context of what is it is not possible in the COP, we're showing up. But all of that brings us back to this document this morning. What I was hearing from somebody yesterday, in fact, you know that the Paris Agreement, I think it was mentioned earlier, the word fossil fuel do not show up in the Paris Agreement at all, not once. And somebody who was there longer ago was explaining to me yesterday that there's what amounts to a gentleman's agreement, and I'm sure the gendering of that term is not accidental, not to mention fossil fuels. And in this document from the UK presidency, we're seeing that happen again. The cover text is essential because it is the statement of what countries agree. So we have all of these decisions, announcements, all the rest that took place on the sidelines outside the scope of the agreement. And in order for them to have effect under the Paris Agreement, they have to be in the decision. What we're hearing is that the UK presidency had the scope, had the option of including the fossil fuel references in the cover decision and in this early draft, I should say, of the cover decision. And in fact, they've been under pressure from the Least Developed Countries Coalition, from the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which represents the 1.2 billion most vulnerable people in the world. There's plenty of pressure to do it, and the UK decided not to. One part of the speculation is that they're trying to avoid conflict. Thank you. One part of the speculation is that they're trying to avoid conflict. A bigger concern, given that it's the Boris Johnson government, is that they're trying to pick spin over substance. And we've seen that in so much of the UK government's positioning coming into this conference. So I want to quickly conclude by telling you that there is a pathway to get to 1.5 degrees Celsius and to get it done right. That's not saying that we have to be pragmatic, but on the contrary, that there are real solutions that are practical, that are cheaper than fossil fuels, and they're ready for prime time right now. Ali talked about the path of least resistance, and increasingly the path of least resistance is the path that gives us the transition to 1.5. But right now what we're hearing is that the UK presidency and negotiators from 195 countries and a bunch of other parties have the next week to get their act together and prove that we're wrong to be accusing them of blah, blah, blah. Thanks very much.